Hello. Uh, this is your Professor Ann Babson. Um, I am giving you this video specifically related to Jane Austen. I'm recording this at a time when my students are reading the epistolary novel by Jane Austen called Lady Susan. Epistolary, which is a word we will discuss in class, means a novel made up of letters, something that was particularly in style in the 18th century. If I were teaching a world literature class, I would not hesitate for a moment to include a wonderful French masterwork called Les Liaisons Dangereuses, which was made into a mediocre movie starring Glenn Close. That's an epistolary novel where love and romance equal power in the context of that epistolary novel. Lady Susan engages romance and seduction of a not overtly sexual kind, but nevertheless, seduction of sensibilities as a form of political power wielded by women. Jane Austen's novels are novels about the world of a certain class of women, women who were of what was called the gentlemanly class, meaning that these were generally ladies who were never going to need to marry someone who had a job. And of course, the idea that a woman herself would have a job was an absurdity. Women who had jobs were domestic servants, were governesses at best, might, as Jane Austen, in the most extraordinary of circumstances, be able to make a living doing writing, although that was very rare indeed. But other women who worked for money were likely to be prostitutes if they were not doing something like seamstressing or washing clothes, or were engaged directly in the household of a noble person, doing something like scrubbing floors. It was a bleak world for women in a lot of ways because there were so few options and they had so little control over so much of what happened to them, because if they were not actually going into trade, which would have been shocking indeed, they were dependent upon some man of proper rank and fortune falling in love with them and asking to marry them. And they really only got one shot at it, by which I mean, well, widows could remarry on the occasions that they did. A young woman could not have her reputation in this society compromised by too much attention paid to one man who was not really interested in her, or interested only in a temporary fashion. If people had reason to think that they might be engaged, meaning that they had spent time alone, that they had shown a marked affection in public for one another, of even little things like touching hands or smiling too much at one another, referring to one another, refusing to dance with other people except for this one person at a ball. All of the, if that turns out to be an engagement and they get married, all is well. But let's say they break up. Well, unless the man was found to be a total liar and con artist, and even then, the aspersions were cast exclusively on the woman. What was wrong with her character to make a man doubt it enough to break off an engagement? It was a very big deal for women to be able to find the right person. And so much of this depended on the money that a woman could provide in terms of income to a man during their marriage. Maybe there would be a lump sum, but more often than not, it would be a small sum that would be an annual income. This was particularly important because of a system, which we will talk about in class briefly, called primogeniture, a system that existed into the 20th century in the noble class, where if you have an estate, in order to keep the estate together, instead of, let's say you have 4 sons in a family, not unusual for a family that was blessed with good health in the 18th century, 19th century, only the eldest son, the firstborn, hence the term from Latin primogenitor, would inherit the estate as a whole. 4 sons, one inheritance going to one son, which meant that there were 3 other sons. Now, what could they do? Their choices were not unlimited in the gentlemanly class or the aristocratic class. Men could respectably go into the military, become colonels of regiments, generals. This was more than acceptable. It was considered quite honorable. And at a time of imperialist expansion of the British Empire, a lot of men really did that. Another option was to go into clergy. And clergymen would make some kind of money and have a house that was part of the dependency of one of these grand estates, where they would be able to live with a family and be able to live really for life, barring any grand scandals, for the rest of their lives with a family. And that was highly respectable. But the second that, say, a man goes to law school and opens up a shop on Fleet Street as a lawyer, or goes into some other commercial profession in the time of Jane Austen, he or she has entered trade. And this is something that means that he has lost social status. He is no longer of the gentlemanly class. He has to work for a living in one of the ignoble professions associated with the dirty pursuit of money. Remember that Jane Austen is writing really right before the beginning and full throttle of the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution does a great deal to shake up the class system in England, and it becomes increasingly clear by the 1890s that the aristocratic class are no longer the wealthy class. There is a bourgeois class, it's very limited, of factory owners who control a great deal of wealth and are almost uniformly highly exploitive of the working class. When I say highly exploitive, think of children's hands getting cut off in machines because a 5-year-old has to work a 14-hour shift as a factory for his family to be able to even survive. The parents' wages are not enough, and there is no suing the landlord for a hand missing. The factory owner for the hand missing. That was the 5-year-old wasn't, the 5-year-old knew what he was getting into when he joined the workforce. He could lose a hand. It was horrible. It was horrible. And it's no accident that the theory of communism is invented in England during its Industrial Revolution. People are really exploited by a few wealthy people who are not nobles and make a ton of money. Before this, though, in Jane Austen's day, there was the royal family, and then there was the aristocrats, meaning barons, earls, dukes, people who had rank by birth. But beyond that, there was a class of people who were related distantly to the people of aristocratic rank, who did not have to work. And it was possible, technically, pre-Industrial Revolution, to rise to the gentlemanly class through a great deal of agricultural prosperity, although it was rare indeed. Sometimes maritime prosperity, if you owned fleets of ships, it still really wasn't all that productive. At some point, all that reputable, excuse me. You would want to be able to sell the business and live off of the profits of a land-based income if you wanted gentlemanly respectability. The idea that you were associated with a business that brought in the income already made you in trade, however lofty you were in the hierarchy of that capitalist system. Um, so as a result, women and men had very limited choices, and they spent a lot of time sort of circling around each other, seeing if they are going to get married or not, at least if we take Jane Austen's word for it, but truly not just Jane Austen's word. And from the women's perspective, which is how Jane Austen tells her stories, delightfully at a time when women's literature was thoroughly discounted as trivial and unimportant. If you wanted to tell a real story, you'd tell about men in battle, you would tell about, men's conflicts with each other. Jane Austen unapologetically presents to us the world of these women in this, yes, limited social class and their concerns. And so when you see references to marriage, are people going to get engaged? Are people not going to get engaged? It's not just like watching an episode with Kardashians in it on the E! Network. It's not just idle gossip. This is the economic fortune of these women for life. By the time they are 25, their economic futures are engraved in stone, basically, based on this marriage economy. And so Jane Austen's stories are at least as much about women trying to have money through this system or deciding not to be exclusively influenced by economic decisions and to have some kind of mutual affection in their marriages, as they are about anything else. And so Lady Susan is a novel about a woman who is widowed and doesn't have a lot of money. But what she has, she refers to, is eloquence. That woman is pretty, and boy, can she talk. She can talk, and she is able, in her own way, to construct a world where she is frankly heartless. She's horrible to her daughter, Frederica. I mean, heaven help somebody whose mother is like Lady Susan, who is ruthless and cruel to this daughter and sees her as a rival for her future happiness. But nevertheless, Lady Susan is carving out also, even in her cruelty, which is evident, a kind of independence that does operate on the basis of the manipulation of both men and women to get what she wants, which is ultimately a kind of sexual freedom and also a kind of economic freedom, because she will marry a rich man who won't ask too many questions about where she was this afternoon. And any rumors he hears about her being with another man, he will readily discount. So she needs to find for herself a man who is someone she can manipulate, malleable, and also is loaded, has money for days. In that sense, Lady Susan, listen, no one should be friends with someone like Lady Susan. She's lying. She's cheating. She's mean. She's just so much wrong with Lady Susan. But a little bit like Dracula, where we find ourselves in the novel of Dracula written some decades later from this date, secretly almost rooting for the vampire. We almost want the vampire to succeed because he's seductive and charming and expresses things we perhaps don't feel entirely comfortable expressing in our own lives. And indirectly, if the vampire wins, we win just a little bit. Lady Susan, for women who are in a system that is very rigid and where the rules simply cannot be broken without major life and death consequences for the women who break them, Lady Susan's potential success, really just messing with people's heads and screwing over men, is very interesting. I think that she is a little bit like a Dracula figure in that we are secretly rooting for this bad, bad woman to succeed, even though we know that what she is doing is wrong, and we probably would never do any of it ourselves. So the rules of the land in a Jane Austen novel are: women are talking all the time about who's getting married and who's not. This is not gossip. This is a life and death economic situation where women have such limited control because they have to wait for someone to fall madly in love with them while they stand in a ladylike posture at the ball. They cannot approach a man to whom they have not been introduced, for instance. They cannot ask a guy to dance at a ball. Shocking. The walls would crumble if a woman did such a thing in the rigid society of Jane Austen's life. And a woman really can't directly say she likes a guy. It can like literally never happen. Or she will be basically placing herself at his mercy, and he can make jokes at her expense with men, which will ruin her reputation, making her unmarriageable for all time. Such a bad situation. So women have to sit still and ladylike and passively wait for someone to love them enough to marry them. And then they also need that the people that want to marry them to be from the right social class, to have enough money, or for themselves to have enough money to tempt someone to choose them as marriage partners, not just love interests. Because there are lots of second sons and third sons floating around in this social system who need to marry successfully, financially. And so some inherited wealth that comes through marriage would be beneficial for a lot of them, particularly if they're in clergy, or maybe they don't quite get it together and do much of anything. They need to marry well. And then they need to find someone that hopefully they can stand. I mean, forget true love, standing the man. Maybe he doesn't look that much like a raccoon. Maybe he doesn't smell like a dead raccoon. Maybe he's not just so dumb you can't stand to be in the room with him where you want to say WATF every time he opens his mouth because everything he says is so stupid. A lot of patience is required of the women in Jane Austen's novels. And a lot of hope is written into her pages. The thing I love about Jane Austen's writing, and that I hope you will love, is that it's when I open her books at any time in my life, I feel like I've been called over by a really close girlfriend who comes, come here, and then whispers a secret into my ear and does so in a way that is really funny based on the observations she makes of human nature. Someone smart, a BFF who can tell me the truth about things in a world where we have to hide behind our fans and pretend that nothing is wrong when perhaps something really is wrong. Like maybe the whole social system is wrong. Anyway, I wanted to give you this information so that you could then understand Lady Susan. Let me know if you have questions. You'll see me in class. Also, you could send me an email. If you've never read a Jane Austen novel before, I can't help but hope you get hooked because I think she's amazing and was so underrated for her whole life. It's just a trivial bit of fluffy pop novel. I think she's one of the better writers of the English language in all time because she is so clever and paints us a picture that is so precise of a really specific place and time.